Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sidney Blumenthal. I'm here with my colleague Sean Wilentz, historian at Princeton University. And we are dealing with, besides all kinds of extraordinary events in the world involving wars, a war against the enemies within conducted by Donald Trump. He wants to invoke the Insurrection Act, he says, over the chaos that he has created involving sending ICE agents to cities and rounding up immigrants. We've had deportations of illegal immigrants going on constantly for decades, but nothing like this. This has turned into a gigantic national trauma that Trump has said is being waged as on the basis of an emergency. Do you have any idea back in history where anyone's done this, any president?
It's historically, no, not at this kind of. Because in part of it's based on a fake. Presidents have done all sorts of repressive things in times of actual warfare. We know that, of various kinds. The Sedition Act in 1918, going back to 1798. But there's no war going on here. There's nothing remotely resembling a war going on here. So right away, we're in a different, a different universe. But the other thing about what he's doing, though, is that, this is kind of, for Trump, in some ways, this is the gift we'll keep on giving politically. Because he will do all of these things and he will send out the troops but at the same time, he's goading people to be violent. And then that justifies his being, doing all of these things. And, and then some Democrats, or I won't say Democrats, but some people out there will be waving Mexican flags and being very, very, angry and so forth. So it's a dynamic that it sets going of repression that then feeds him politically because it's good for him politically. This is what's diabolical about what he's doing, I think, not just in terms of the Constitution, but in terms of the politics of it. But there's nothing like it that I can see. And I wanted to ask our guest later on, in a little while, I can't remember a time, federalizing the National Guard, we've seen that in our lifetimes, right? Johnson did it with Selma. We saw it, Eisenhower did it with Little Rock. Calling in the Marines. I was trying to think of the last time that U.S. Marines were called into American streets, and the last ones I could think of were the British Marines in 1814 in Washington. Those are the last Marines that I could think of. I cannot recall a regular U.S. military being used against American citizens. Maybe about that, but I can't.
Yeah, I believe they were called in. I think it was 182nd Airborne, perhaps, to LA during the 1992 riots, but that came in with the permission of the governor. I read an amazing article, Sean, in a publication called The American Spectator. It was a very valuable publication. It's called Caesar in California, about what's going on in California and its larger meaning and its legal meaning. And its author happens to be with us to elucidate what's going on. Jonathan Weiner is right here. He has been the U.S. Special Envoy for Libya, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement, and counsel to U.S. Senator John Kerry on the Foreign Relations Committee. He has written and lectured widely on U.S. Middle East policy, counterterrorism, international money laundering, illicit networks, corruption, U.S.-Russia issues, and also has a very deep understanding of the legal basis of what's going on. And so welcome to the Court of History, John.
In the 90s, I was also working a lot on immigration issues from the point of view of how you dealt with people who invited themselves into the United States. And the basic idea was wet foot, dry foot. If you had the Coast Guard or whatever stop people before they got to the United States, you could send them home. And if they got to the United States, they had rights. And once they got to the United States, those rights had to be honored. And so we were all about building relationships with other countries that were where migrants were coming from, to figure out how to work cooperatively with them. to strengthen their capabilities to protect themselves as well as us. And by doing that, you could wind up defending the sovereignties of everybody. And that was policy back in the Clinton years. And it's been the approach pretty much of every other U.S. government administration other than the Trump administration to try to do that. You build up other people's capabilities and your own, and you work with the problem.
Yeah. In your article, you talk about Trump's rhetorical claims that he uses to justify the use of military force. I wonder if you could run through some of his rhetoric for us to explain its use and how he also twists that to try and manipulate the law.
Well, the law is that if you're suffering from a foreign invasion or a domestic insurrection, both of which threaten the ability of the United States to exist as a country, the president's got extraordinary powers, which is the ability to use the military to deal with those issues. Now, illegal immigration is not actually a domestic insurrection, and it's not actually an invasion by a foreign government. So Mr. Trump has consistently tried to say the immigrants are being directed by hostile foreign governments to invade the United States. It's not true. There's no factual basis for it.
So what's the legal basis? What's the legal theory underlining this?
Yeah, and he's similarly trying to say there's a domestic insurrection in support of the foreign invaders. So that's the other side.
So those are two different things. You're having an invasion and an insurrection.
Yes.
He says.
And he's doing both of them because they're both strands that allow him to invoke the powers given to him by Congress a very long time ago, early 19th century, in the forerunners to what today is the Insurrection Act. It's three related federal laws which together are called the Insurrection Act.
What is the Insurrection Act? Tell us about it.
Basic idea.
Why is he so fixed on the Insurrection Act? What can he do with it?
It gives him absolutely huge, almost unfettered power to use the military against Americans domestically. And that's the whole game. This is crossing the Rubicon. This is Caesar saying, I'm not going to use the forces of Rome to deal with the foreign barbarians and quell instability at the outer edges of the empire. I'm going to bring them back to Rome and shut down anybody who threatens me. That's what crossing the Rubicon was all about. That's why I call it the piece Caesar in California. Because the idea here is to create a crisis that allows them to claim it's a foreign invasion and a domestic insurrection, and then have it sufficiently robust factually that when it gets up to the Supreme Court, they'll say, yep, he's got those rights. He can use the Marines, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force domestically. And no one can say otherwise because he has that authority. That's the game.
There's actually a law against using the U.S. military.
The Boston Act.
Yeah. What? That's a post-Reconstruction law.
Yeah. But the Supreme Court's going to have to interpret the interplay of those. And the Insurrection Act absolutely gives a president faced with those conditions, those powers. The problem is when you've got really weak facts, when you don't have an actual insurrection and you don't have an actual invasion, is it enough for the president just to say it? But you have to then go in back of it to understand it. And the facts have to be there. And that's really up to, ultimately, unfortunately, this Supreme Court. Because this Supreme Court could say, well, it's the president who's saying it. We're not going to make an independent the decision about whether the facts are right or not. He sees the threat, so we're going to give him some deference. And there's huge risk of that. And if we get there, then at that point we have a military which is not trained to deal with civilian populations, but is trained to deal with war fighting and does a terrible job at policing even foreign populations. You then can unleash them on the American people almost anywhere.
And then you have something that the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, feared above all else, which was a standing army that could be used by the powers that be against the American people. You will have that in existence. You'll have, in effect, overthrown a fundamental principle behind the American Revolution in the first place. This to me is extraordinary. And but it's made possible only by the fact, I would think, that the president gets to call what a war is and what a war isn't. That to me is preposterous, frankly.
Well, we've been on this slope for decades now. Congress has tried to rein in with things like the War Powers Act, but basically, when the president acts as commander in chief, there's been very little jurisprudence or prudence from Congress, congressional prudence or jurisprudence to stop it. Now, in this case, it's one thing to do it against foreigners, right? You're going to do it against somebody in Iraq or somebody in Iran or somebody in Yemen.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But when you're doing it against the American public, that's something else, which is why I use the term Caesar and why I'm talking about crossing the Rubicon, because it seems to me that is the historic analogy, which is when you turn your military forces against your domestic population, which is what he's trying to set in motion here. So he's ratcheting it up. Provocation, arrest people, pull them out of cars, break the car windows, come into their workplaces, come into the courtrooms, arrest federal judges, arrest members of Congress, throw senators to the ground and handcuff them with their hands behind their back. Tell everybody that don't act. We'll get you, and then generate outrage, generate upset, generate protests, generate no King's Days. And when you generated that, expect that somebody somewhere will throw a rock or stop ingress or egress to a federal building, or do something that can justify you in invoking those extraordinary powers of the Insurrection Act to then ratchet it up further and to essentially disempower domestic law enforcement from functioning and empower the president to directly use force on the American people, military force. Now, I've been to the U.S. government shooting ranges, and I've seen the kinds of weapons that they have. And the firepower is absolutely astonishing. And if they bring out that kind of firepower against the American public, there's almost no one and nothing that can withstand it.
Yeah.
And
Jonathan, I wrote an article today.
Terrifying risk.
Yeah, I wrote an article today in The Guardian about Donald Trump's stages of insurrection. The first one he thought was an insurrection, which wasn't at all, were the protests against the murder of George Floyd. And there was a demonstration in Lafayette Park across from the White House. And he turned to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and he said, "Can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something." And Milley did not say he could do that. And Trump got agitated and ordered the park police to clear the park with riding horses down on the crowd. And then, as everyone recalls, he marched across the park and stood in front of St. John's Church, held the Bible upside down, and he made Milley accompany him, which Milley to this day regrets and felt that the military had been abused through his presence at Trump's order. And he felt subsequently, as he said, that Trump was looking for a Reichstag Fire, some pretext to declare an Insurrection Act and martial law.
He was dressed down by the other members of the Joint Chiefs right after that incident and apologized to them and apologized to the military, and the American people as a whole said it will not happen again, for which Trump basically accused him of treason.
Correct.
Yeah. And then, of course, we had January 6th, and we know who called the National Guard on January 6th and who did not. The one who did not was Donald Trump. The one who did was Mike Pence, who was cornered in a basement garage underneath the Capitol while a mob was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," while Trump was watching this gleefully on TV for hours. So he didn't really care. And he subsequently said Pence deserved it. So there's that in insurrection. That's the second one, isn't it?
That direction, Trump did not call out at that point
Right.
The authorities under the Insurrection Act, though I worried about it. Because if he had called out the military at that point in connection with the insurrection, it could have been used in a variety of ways, not just against the insurrectionists. So I was deeply concerned that that was a direction that we were going to go, where we would find the military protecting Mr. Trump's staying on one way or another.
Yeah.
The military itself was also worried about Trump calling the military because they thought he might use it on behalf of the insurrectionists,
Right.
Yes.
and to stop the Congress from the counting of the votes of the Electoral College that would declare Joe Biden the winner of the 2020 presidential election.
That's right.
Yeah. So now here we are.
Current insurrection.
Yeah, where Trump is provoking incidents. And these are sort of mini Reichstag fires he's provoking, as General Milley predicted.
That's where we are. And so the idea, I think, is to continue to ratchet this up until the facts are strong enough or close to strong enough that he can invoke the Insurrection Act. The one thing that surprised me about what he's done so far is he hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act. He's invoked a precursor statute, which just authorizes him to call out the military, but doesn't say what for exactly. It doesn't say what they can do. It's an adjunct, which is usually referred to when the Insurrection Act has actually been invoked. So he's actually doing a precursor. I'm going to have these Marines available. I'm federalizing the National Guard. It's not clear what they're actually going to do other than hang out. And when they want them to do stuff is when I invoke the Insurrection Act, which he's deferred doing so far. And I think he's deferred doing it because he does not yet have the facts on the ground that are strong enough for his lawyers, the people who represented him when he was a defendant in criminal cases, to say, well, we feel confident that the Supreme Court will sustain your use of this. Let's get Hornet's Nest a little further first. Let's get some more violence going to further justify the presidential decision.
Well, the California Attorney General Rob Bonta has filed a suit on behalf of the state of California against Trump and Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, saying that they're engaged in all unlawful behavior, that they had no legal right to federalize the National Guard without asking the governor's approval, and that the posse, they've gone around the Posse Comitatus Act and mobilized Marines in violation of it.
Right.
And the only way you can do that is if you is under the Insurrection Act. So where does this leave us? Does this leave us with Trump attempting to create a big enough conflagration in order to create the facts, as it were, although they would be falsely created facts or, created in bad faith, and he would be the progenitor of them, that, as you say, a court dominated by conservatives up to the Supreme Court might approve. Is that where we are? What kind of scenario can you see besides that?
That is the scenario. It's clear to me that his language presages that scenario, the language of invasion, the language of insurrection, the actions to have the Marines in place presages, and the failure to use the Insurrection Act so far, but to use a statute that's never before been used without the Insurrection Act, as near as I can tell, and I did some extensive searching, is to get everything in place for the day he can declare that. And in order to declare that, he's going to want to have more incidents. And so the goal is to get those incidents going. You call them mini Reichstag fires, and that's a good analogy. But it's going to have to be enough so that when he does it, we've got some drama going on. And the drama is sufficient to mobilize some support for him politically and provide a foundation for the judges to say, okay,
And it's his version of the Enabling Act would come after that, right? Talk about the Reichstag Fire. I mean, what we're talking about is something on the order, tell me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but it's something on the order of a kind of presidential police state, where he is basically, left local law enforcement to the side, and he decides where the military is going to go, and there it is. Is that not right?
It's absolutely right. It's exactly what's going on. It is the disabling of domestic law enforcement, replacing it with the military. Now, it isn't quite martial law, because martial law is just military law. But what it is it's the military and the president deciding how domestic laws are enforced instead of local law enforcement. It's bypassing all of that to put the authority behind him, which again is why I referred to Caesar.
Yeah.
It's the closest analogy I can think of in history for this particular set of moves, where you basically are taking the entire military, turning it to domestic use at the direction of one person.
Well, that's frightening, Jonathan. I want to thank you for your article that I hope everyone reads in the Washington Spectator, Caesar in California. My article appears in The Guardian. It is called Trump's Insurrection Routine Fuel Violence, Spawn Chaos, Shrug Off the Law. And thank you again for your acute insights on the court of history, which is the final court, on behalf of myself and Sean Wilentz. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.